The house smelled of rosemary and roasted chicken when Eleanor stepped onto the porch. Through the frosted window, she could see her son Michael carving meat. His sleeves rolled neatly, his tie still on from work. It had been months since she last joined them for dinner. She hadn't called ahead, she never used to have to. Families didn't need appointments, she thought. But as soon as she rang the doorbell, she sensed something off. Voices paused. Plates clinked. Then Samantha's voice, sharp and clear, cut through the air. "Who let that old woman in?" The words weren't whispered. They were meant to land. Eleanor froze, her hand still resting on the doorframe. When Michael appeared, his smile was thin, almost apologetic. "Mom, you should have called," he said softly, glancing over his shoulder as though her presence might embarrass someone. Samantha stood behind him, arms crossed, a polite mask stretched over irritation. "We would have prepared something more suitable," she added. Eleanor forced a small smile. "I brought dessert," she said, lifting the foil-covered pie she had baked that morning. Her voice trembled slightly. "Apple, like you used to like Michael." No one responded. Andrew, their 16-year-old son, barely looked up from his phone. The flicker of the screen reflected in his glasses, casting blue light across a face too young to already be so detached. Eleanor placed a pie on the counter, trying to ignore the awkward silence that filled the room like static. "I didn't mean to interrupt," she said, glancing around the modern kitchen. Cold steel, bright lights. Not a trace of warmth she remembered from when Michael was little. Samantha finally broke the quiet with a practiced smile. "Well, since you're here, make yourself comfortable." The tone made it sound like anything but an invitation. Dinner passed like a long, slow punishment. The table was set for 4, yet it felt like Eleanor was invisible. Every time she tried to start a conversation about the weather, her garden, the neighbor's new dog, it died midair. Samantha's eyes flicked toward Michael each time, as if asking silently, "She done yet?" Michael didn't notice, or pretended not to. He poured himself more wine, avoided her gaze, and kept talking about a new highway project his firm had landed. Eleanor listened quietly, her hands folded in her lap. The laughter between Michael and Samantha was forced, but synchronized, like actors following a script she didn't know. When her throat grew dry, she cleared it and said softly, "Could I have some water, dear?" Samantha sighed, a sound heavy enough to fill the room. "There's a pitcher on the counter," she said, not looking up from her plate. Eleanor stood, fetched it herself, and returned to find her chair slightly pushed aside, as though she no longer fit in the picture. Trying to hold onto some thread of normalcy, she smiled at Andrew. "How's school, sweetheart?" He shrugged, eyes still on the phone. "Fine." "You're taller," she said, "almost like your father at that age." "Yeah." He didn't look up. Moments later, conversation turned to money. Michael complained about mortgage rates, the rising cost of utilities. Eleanor hesitated before speaking. "I've been meaning to ask you." "Michael," she said gently, "the electric bill, do you still get those notifications for my address? I think one might have gone unpaid." Samantha's fork froze midair. "Unpaid," she repeated, her tone like ice. "You're behind on bills again." Eleanor blinked, startled. No, I just wasn't sure if—" Samantha cut her off with a small laugh. "You know, Michael, maybe it's time we talk about moving her somewhere more manageable. A place that handles things like that." Eleanor's face burned. She turned toward her son, waiting for him to stop it, to defend her, to say, "Don't talk to my mother that way." But Michael only sighed, swirling his wine. "Sam's not wrong, Mom. Maybe a smaller place would be easier. You're not getting any younger." Andrew, without looking up, mumbled, "Grandma, there's this really nice senior home near our school. It's like modern and stuff." The words pierced deeper than he knew. Silence fell. The ticking of the clock in the hallway suddenly grew deafening. Eleanor placed her napkin down. her fingers trembling slightly. "I see," she said, her voice quiet but steady. "I didn't mean to cause trouble." No one stopped her as she rose from the table. Samantha murmured something about dessert, but Eleanor pretended not to hear. She picked up her coat, the same gray wool one she'd worn for years, and stepped outside. The cold Iowa air bit at her cheeks. Behind her, laughter resumed faintly, too quick, too easy, as if her absence had lightened the room. She stood for a moment on the porch, clutching her purse, watching the snowflakes drift under the streetlight. She thought about all the Sundays she'd spent cooking for Michael, how she'd stayed up late sewing his prom suit, how proud she'd been when he bought this house. Now she was an inconvenience in it. When she finally started walking toward her car, the sound of her shoes on the frozen driveway echoed in the quiet street. She didn't cry, not yet, but the silence inside her felt heavier than any winter night. The wind howled softly against the old windows of the Beaverdale bungalow, the kind of winter wind that seemed to speak through every crack in the wood. Eleanor sat alone in the living room, her only light coming from a floor lamp with a faded beige shade. The room smelled faintly of cedar and old books, the scent of a life that had been lived, not just passed through. On the mantel, time had lined up its evidence. Her wedding photograph, slightly yellowed, Michael's graduation picture in its cracked frame, and beside them, the empty rocking chair that had belonged to her late husband, Thomas. It creaked occasionally when the house shifted, as if it still remembered the rhythm of his weight. She had been home for hours, but her coat still hung on the back of the chair half-buttoned. Her mind replayed every moment of the dinner, Samantha's disdain, Michael's silence, Andrew's indifferent tone, the way the laughter returned after she left. It all looped in her head until the humiliation turned into something deeper, quieter, harder. Eleanor poured herself a cup of tea from the pot she had made hours earlier. It had gone lukewarm, but she drank it anyway. On the table lay a few unpaid envelopes, her reading glasses, and a stack of old letters tied with ribbon. Letters Thomas had written to her when he was away building bridges in the 70s. "For when you forget how strong you are," one of them read. She traced her finger over the words, and for the first time in a long time, she felt the sting of those words not as comfort, but as a challenge. She walked slowly through the house, touching the walls as she went, the same walls she had painted herself when Michael was a boy, staying up late after work at the diner. She remembered the nights she'd come home exhausted, taking off her shoes in silence so she wouldn't wake him. The time she sold her mother's pearl earrings to buy him his first computer because his classmates had one and he didn't. The pride she'd felt when he graduated, and the way he'd promised, "Someday I'll take care of you, Mom." "Someday," she whispered to the empty room. Her voice cracked on the word. Her eyes fell on the deed folder she kept in the small wooden cabinet under the window. She pulled it out and sat at the kitchen table. The paper inside had grown soft at the edges from years of handling. 5 years ago, when Thomas's savings and her will had met in quiet agreement, she'd transferred the title to Michael's name. "It'll make things easier for him later," she had told Arthur, the family's lawyer. She had believed it was the right thing to do, a gesture of love and trust. Now, as she ran her thumb over the notary seal, the irony felt heavy in her chest. Her eyes blurred for a moment, and she set the paper down, pressing her palms flat against the table as if steadying herself against a wave. The radiator hissed faintly in the corner, filling the silence with a low hum. Outside, snow began to fall again, fine, steady flakes that glimmered against the dark glass. Eleanor sat there for a long while, her thoughts shifting from grief to something sharper. Not anger, not yet, but awareness. The realization that she had spent so much of her life giving, that she had forgotten how to keep. The people she loved most had learned to take from her without shame, because she had taught them it was safe to do so. She reached for her teacup, finding it cold. Then she glanced once more at the deed, at her own signature beside Michael's. The ink looked faded, but the name was still hers, Eleanor Whittaker. For a brief moment, she smiled, not out of joy, but out of recognition. There was still something left inside her that belonged entirely to her. She rose, turned off the lamp, and walked toward the window. The snow outside shimmered beneath the streetlight, blanketing the quiet neighborhood in silver. In her reflection, she saw a woman older than she remembered. Tired, yes, but not broken. Somewhere behind her eyes, something stirred. It wasn't rage or despair this time. It was resolve, quiet, deliberate, and new. Eleanor stood there until the clock struck midnight, the ticking echoing through the still house. Then she whispered softly to the darkness, almost to herself, "I'm not done yet." 2 days later, the phone rang just as Eleanor was folding a stack of clean linens. The afternoon light filtered weakly through the lace curtains, glinting off the porcelain teacup on the table. She reached for the phone, expecting it to be Martha from next door. Instead, it was Michael. His voice carried that deliberate calm he used when he wanted to sound reasonable, but was already rehearsing the outcome he wanted. "Mom, I've been thinking," he began, clearing his throat. "You shouldn't be alone out there anymore. The house is too big, and winter's just getting worse. Sam and I talked, and we think it's best if you move in with us, just for a little while, until we figure things out." Eleanor's hand tightened around the edge of the counter. "Figure what out exactly?" she asked quietly. "You know," Michael continued, "your bills, your medications, the maintenance on the house. It's a lot for one person. You deserve to relax. We can take care of everything for you, the groceries, the payments, even the house. I'll make sure it's looked after." There it was, the house. The careful phrasing wasn't lost on her. Looked after, as though she were entrusting a pet, not her home. Before she could answer, another voice chimed in from the background, bright and falsely cheerful. "It's for your comfort, Mrs. Whittaker," Samantha said loudly, her tone dripping with staged concern. "You'll have your own room. No need to worry about chores or bills. We'll handle all that. It's time for you to rest a little." Eleanor could almost see her daughter-in-law's expression through the line, that fixed smile, the kind that never reached her eyes. She let a few seconds pass. The silence on her end stretched just long enough for Michael to grow uneasy. "Mom, are you still there?" "I am," Eleanor replied, her voice calm and deliberate. "And the answer is no." The word hung in the air, simple and solid. For a moment, there was nothing, no sound, no breath, just a stunned pause that felt heavier than any argument could have been. Then came Michael's voice again, now clipped with surprise. "No, Mom, I don't think you understand what we're offering. We're trying to help you." "I understand perfectly," she said. "You want to manage my home. I want to live in it." The line went quiet again. Samantha whispered something she couldn't make out, followed by Michael's frustrated sigh. "You're being stubborn," he said finally. "We're just worried about you." "Don't be," she replied softly. "I've been alone before. I'll be fine." She heard him inhale sharply, as if to protest, but then he stopped. Maybe it was the tone of her voice, steady, absolute, something he hadn't heard from her in years. After a long silence, he muttered, "All right, if that's how you want it," and hung up. Eleanor stood still for a while, the quiet of the house wrapping around her. Then she set the phone down and let out a slow breath she hadn't realized she was holding. She walked into the kitchen, filled the kettle, and waited for it to whistle. The sound was small but grounding, a reminder that her rhythm still belonged to her. She poured herself a cup of tea and carried it to the window. Outside, the garden lay under a thick sheet of snow, the same yard where she had once planted lilies with Michael when he was 8. The bird bath was frozen solid, a ring of ice catching the weak winter sun. She wrapped her cardigan tighter and took a sip of her tea. The bitterness of the brew steadied her. For the first time in a long while, she didn't feel like a guest in her own story. She wasn't angry, Not even hurt. Just certain. Her gaze drifted to the distant trees beyond the fence, their bare branches swaying against the gray sky. "It's time," she whispered to herself, almost smiling. "Time to take my life back." The doorbell rang just as Eleanor was finishing her morning tea. She wasn't expecting anyone. Martha usually called before stopping by. But when she opened the door, the sight that greeted her was no surprise. Samantha stood there in a beige wool coat, holding a grocery bag and wearing that tight, saccharine smile that always made Eleanor feel like a patient being humored. "Good morning." "Mrs. Whittaker," Samantha said brightly, stepping inside before Eleanor could invite her. "I was in the neighborhood and thought I'd drop off some things. You know, just to check on you." Eleanor took the bag from her hands. Inside were items she hadn't asked for: almond milk, low-sodium crackers, herbal supplements. "That's thoughtful of you," she said evenly, placing the bag on the counter. "Oh, it's nothing," Samantha replied, glancing around the kitchen as though inspecting it. "I just wanted to make sure you're eating well. At your age, nutrition is so important. And memory too, right? It's easy to forget meals when you're alone." Eleanor looked up slowly. "I've managed to remember breakfast, lunch, and dinner for the last 68 years, she said with a faint smile. "I think I'll survive another week." Samantha's smile tightened. "Of course," she said quickly, smoothing her hair. "I didn't mean anything by it. It's just, Michael and I worry. You know how harsh Iowa winters can be. If you ever slipped or got dizzy, well, it might take hours before anyone found out." Eleanor stirred her tea calmly. "I appreciate the concern, Samantha, but I've lived through 40 Iowa winters, including the one where the pipes froze solid for 2 weeks. I'll manage this one too." For a moment, silence filled the kitchen. The clock ticked, steady and unbothered. Samantha looked around, clearly searching for a new angle. "You keep the house so tidy," she said finally. "It's just so big for one person. Must be exhausting to maintain." "It is," Eleanor admitted. Then she set down her spoon and met Samantha's eyes. "But it's my house, and I'll live here as long as I please." The words were calm, almost gentle, yet they landed like a door closing. Samantha blinked, startled. She hadn't expected resistance. For years, Eleanor had been the accommodating one, the mother-in-law who apologized first, who stayed quiet when disrespected. But now, there was something in her tone that made Samantha hesitate. Recovering quickly, Samantha laughed lightly, the sound brittle. "Of course. I was just saying it might be easier for you to let us handle things." "We could. I'm sure you could," Eleanor interrupted, her voice soft but unyielding. "But I'm not asking you to." The younger woman's posture stiffened. She picked up her purse, pretending to glance at her phone. "Well, I should get going. I just wanted to stop by and see how you were doing." "I'm doing just fine," Eleanor said. At the doorway, Samantha turned, forcing a final smile. "You're very independent, Mrs. Whittaker. I admire that." "I know," Eleanor replied. Samantha blinked again, as if unsure whether it was a compliment or a warning. Then she nodded curtly and stepped out into the cold. When the door clicked shut, the house fell back into silence. Eleanor stood there for a moment, listening to the sound of Samantha's heels crunching over the snow-covered driveway. It was the first time in years that a conversation had ended on her terms. She walked back into the kitchen, poured herself another cup of tea, and allowed herself to breathe. The air felt different now, lighter, clearer, as though something invisible had shifted. For so long, she had measured her words, swallowed her pride, tried to keep peace no matter the cost. But this morning, she hadn't apologized. She hadn't softened her tone to make someone else comfortable. She sat down in her favorite chair by the window, the one that faced the street, and watched the snow drift lazily through the air. The garden lay quiet beneath its white blanket, untouched and peaceful. A faint smile tugged at her lips. It wasn't victory she felt, at least not the loud kind. It was something quieter, something steadier. The feeling of standing up without raising her voice, of reclaiming a piece of herself that she hadn't realized was missing. For the first time in years, Eleanor Whittaker felt like she had her voice back. The next afternoon, the sky hung low and gray over Beaverdale, the kind of still winter day when even the birds seemed to stay quiet. Eleanor sat in her armchair, the phone pressed to her ear, staring absently at the framed photos on the mantel. It took her 3 tries to find Arthur Reynolds' number, who was one of the few people left who still had a landline. When he answered, his familiar voice carried the same dry humor she remembered from decades ago. "Eleanor Whittaker, I was wondering when you'd call. I saw your Christmas card last year. You still have better handwriting than my secretary." His warmth drew a faint smile from her. "Arthur, I need to ask you something about my house," she said. "It's probably nothing, but can you stop by sometime this week?" "Today," he said simply. "I'm already in the area." 2 hours later, his old Navy sedan pulled into her driveway. He looked older now, slower steps, more silver in his hair, but his eyes were as sharp as ever. When she opened the door, he raised a brow and said, "You still make the best tea in Polk County, I hope?" She laughed softly. "Only if you still take 2 sugars." They sat in the living room, 2 relics of another era surrounded by quiet. The air smelled faintly of lemon polish and Earl Grey. Arthur placed his worn briefcase on the coffee table, folded his hands, and looked at her. "So," he said, "tell me what's on your mind." Eleanor hesitated, then spoke carefully. "5 years ago, when Thomas passed, you helped me transfer the title of this house to Michael's name. You said it would make things easier someday." Arthur nodded. "That's right. Well," she continued, "Michael and Samantha seem eager to manage it now. I just want to understand what rights I still have. I don't want to cause trouble, just to know." Arthur studied her for a long moment. Then he leaned down, unlatched his briefcase, and pulled out a thin folder. "You're not causing trouble, Eleanor. You're asking the right question. And the answer," he said, sliding the papers across the table, "is that you still own more than you think." She frowned slightly. "How do you mean?" "When we did the transfer," he explained, "I recorded a life estate deed with full power of sale. That means the property is in Michael's name for inheritance purposes. But you," he tapped the document, "retain the right to live here as long as you wish. And if you ever decide to sell it, you can. You don't need his consent, his signature, or anyone's approval." Eleanor blinked, unsure she'd heard correctly. "You mean I could sell this house right now, if I wanted?" Arthur nodded. "Legally, yes. Michael's interest doesn't take effect until after your lifetime. You're still in full control." For a moment, Eleanor didn't speak. Her mind raced through the last few days, the dinner, Samantha's words, the phone call, the visit. She had thought she was cornered, powerless in her own home. And now, here was Arthur, calmly handing her the key she hadn't known she still possessed. He watched her face carefully. "I never told you back then because Thomas asked me not to. He didn't want you worrying about legalities. He just wanted you safe. But I made sure the paperwork reflected that. You deserve to decide your own life, Eleanor." She leaned back slowly in her chair, the air in her lungs suddenly feeling lighter. "All this time," she whispered, "they thought they had control." Arthur smiled faintly. "They assumed. You never corrected them." Eleanor exhaled a small, incredulous laugh, slipping out. She looked at the deed, at her own name written clearly beside the legal clause, and something unfamiliar stirred inside her. Relief mixed with quiet power. It wasn't joy exactly, but the awareness of balance being restored. Arthur set his cup down and stood. "You'll know what to do with that information when the time comes," he said gently. "Just remember, it's still your house." After he left, Eleanor remained seated for a long time, The papers spread across her lap. The ticking clock filled the silence. For years, she had believed she'd signed away her independence out of love. But now she knew she hadn't lost it. She'd simply forgotten it was still hers. And for the first time in many years, Eleanor Whittaker felt something she hadn't in a long time. Control. That Saturday afternoon, the quiet rhythm of the neighborhood was broken by the crunch of tires on Eleanor's driveway. She glanced out the window and felt her stomach tighten. Michael's black SUV had pulled up beside the front steps, and all three of them were there, Michael, Samantha, and Andrew. It wasn't a casual visit. She could tell by the look of determination on her son's face and the way Samantha's coat hung perfectly pressed despite the cold. Eleanor took a slow breath and opened the door before they could ring the bell. "Well," she said, forcing a small smile, "this is a surprise." Michael smiled back, too brightly. "We were just in the area, Mom. Thought we'd stop by." "Of course you were," she murmured, stepping aside to let them in. Samantha carried a casserole dish. Her go-to gesture whenever she wanted to make an intrusion seemed generous. "We brought lunch," she said, her voice syrupy. "Thought you might like some company." Eleanor took the dish and placed it on the counter. "That's thoughtful. I didn't realize I was lonely." Samantha gave a light laugh that didn't reach her eyes. "Oh, we just worry about you, Mrs. Whittaker. It's not safe for you to be alone. That's all." Michael cleared his throat, clearly trying to sound diplomatic. "Mom, I know you don't like when we hover, but Sam and I have been thinking. It really isn't good for you to live by yourself anymore. The house, the stairs, the maintenance, it's too much. You could fall and no one would even know until—" "I've lived here 30 years without falling," Eleanor interrupted gently. "I don't intend to start now." Samantha's smile faltered, and she turned to Andrew, giving him a subtle nudge. "Why don't you tell Grandma what we talked about?" The boy looked up from his phone, uneasy. Grandma," he began, shifting his weight. "Mom and Dad say you shouldn't live alone. You know, it's not safe." Eleanor crouched slightly so she was at eye level with him. Her voice softened. "And what do you think, sweetheart? Do you believe that?" Andrew hesitated, glancing at his parents. I think you're fine. Grandma." His honesty hung in the air like a fragile thing. Samantha's eyes flashed irritation, and Michael looked away, embarrassed. Eleanor smiled gently. "That's all I needed to hear." The silence that followed was thick and awkward. Samantha busied herself adjusting her scarf, pretending not to hear the quiet rebuke woven into those words. Michael shifted his stance, his expression tight. "Mom," he said after a moment, "this isn't about pride. We just want what's best for you." "I know," Eleanor said evenly, "but sometimes what's best for me sounds suspiciously like what's convenient for you." Michael's face colored slightly. "That's not fair. Neither is assuming I can't make decisions about my own life." Samantha's voice sharpened. "We're offering help, not control." Eleanor looked straight at her. "And I'm saying no, not rebellion." Her tone softened again as she added, "This isn't stubbornness. It's dignity." The words landed heavier than she expected. Even Andrew looked up from his phone. For a moment, no one spoke. Outside, the wind rattled the bare branches against the window pane. Michael finally exhaled and rubbed the back of his neck. "All right," he said quietly. "We just wanted to talk." "I know," Eleanor replied, "and now we have." When they left a few minutes later, she watched their car reverse down the snowy driveway until it disappeared beyond the trees. The house fell silent again, but this time the quiet felt like peace, not loneliness. She walked back to the living room, pausing by the mantel where the old family photo stood. Michael's graduation picture stared back at her, his proud smile, her hand on his shoulder. She touched the frame lightly, her eyes steady. She finally understood what this was. Not concern, not care. It was possession disguised as love. They weren't trying to help her. They were trying to take what they believed was already theirs. Eleanor sat down, folded her hands, and let out a slow, steady breath. They had underestimated her once. It wouldn't happen again. By Wednesday morning, the snow had turned to a dull slush, melting in streaks down the front steps. Eleanor was sitting by the window with her knitting when she heard the familiar knock. 3 quick taps, then one longer. Samantha. Eleanor didn't move right away. She waited a moment, letting the rhythm of her own breath even out before answering the door. As expected, her daughter-in-law stood there, perfectly put together in a beige coat and leather gloves, carrying 2 grocery bags as if they were peace offerings. "Good morning, Mrs. Whittaker," Samantha said with a bright smile. "I thought I'd drop off a few things. Michael had a late meeting, so I figured I could come by and check on you myself." Eleanor stepped aside. "You seem to be checking on me quite a bit lately." Samantha's smile didn't falter, but her tone softened. "I just worry. You've been alone a lot, and winter can be hard at your age. I thought maybe we could talk, maybe see how you're doing." Eleanor nodded slowly. "I'm doing fine, thank you. The house and I have an understanding. We take care of each other." They moved into the kitchen. Samantha began unloading groceries without asking. Fresh vegetables, vitamins, a loaf of bread. "You shouldn't be lifting heavy things," she said sweetly. "I mean, not at your age." Eleanor arched an eyebrow. "You've mentioned my age 3 times in 5 minutes. Are you worried I've forgotten it?" The younger woman froze, caught off guard. "Oh, no, I just mean, I know what you mean." Eleanor interrupted gently, taking an apple from the bag and setting it on the counter. "You mean well. You always do." Samantha gave a strained laugh, brushing imaginary crumbs off the counter. "We all just want what's best for you, Mrs. Whittaker. I know you think we're being pushy, but Michael and I only want to make sure everything's handled properly." "Handled," Eleanor repeated softly, tasting the word. "That's an interesting choice." Samantha fidgeted, realizing her phrasing had betrayed her. "I didn't mean, oh, I think you did." Eleanor turned to face her, eyes calm but unflinching. "You remind me of my mother sometimes." That caught Samantha off guard. "Your mother?" "Yes," Eleanor said, her gaze distant for a moment. She was a practical woman, smart but not sentimental. Before she passed, she told me something I never forgot. She picked up the apple again, rolling it gently in her palm. "Never trust anyone completely when property's involved, not even family." Samantha's smile faltered. "That's a little cynical, don't you think?" "It's realistic," Eleanor said. "People change when there's something to gain. Some just change faster than others." The silence that followed was heavy enough to feel physical. Samantha looked away, pretending to adjust her scarf. "Well," she said finally, forcing lightness back into her voice, "I'll make sure to pass that wisdom along to Andrew. He could use a few life lessons." "I'm sure you will," Eleanor replied. Samantha gathered her purse and gloves, suddenly eager to leave. "Anyway, I'll let you rest. Enjoy the groceries. We'll talk soon, all right?" "Of course," Eleanor said. When the door closed behind her, Eleanor didn't move for a while. The groceries sat untouched on the counter, the apple still in her hand. The house was quiet again, save for the ticking of the kitchen clock. She turned to look out the window at the bare trees swaying against the gray sky. Then she set the apple down and reached for the phone. Her hand didn't tremble this time. Arthur answered on the second ring. "Eleanor, I was just thinking about you." "You once asked if I was ready to make hard decisions," she said. Her voice was calm, certain. "I am now." There was a pause on the other end. When Arthur spoke again, his tone had changed. "You know what that means, Eleanor. Once we start, there's no turning back." Eleanor looked out at the yard, at the faint outlines of footprints already fading in the melting snow. "That relationship already changed," she said quietly. "I just hadn't noticed." And with that, the decision was made the following afternoon. The wind outside carried the sharp bite of late winter, rattling the bare branches against Eleanor's window. She was seated in her armchair when the phone rang again. Arthur's voice came through, lower and more deliberate than usual. "Eleanor," he said without preamble, "I need you to come by my office. There's something you should see." An hour later, she stepped into his modest office in East Village, the same one that still smelled faintly of old leather and coffee. The shelves were lined with thick legal binders, a comforting reminder that Arthur was as meticulous as ever. He gestured for her to sit, then pulled out a manila folder and laid it gently on the desk between them. "I did some digging," he said. "You were right to trust your instincts." Eleanor folded her hands in her lap. "What did you find?" Arthur adjusted his glasses and opened the folder. 2 months ago, Michael and Samantha took out a personal loan, a large one, and according to the filing, they used your house as collateral. For a long moment, Eleanor didn't move. "My house," she repeated slowly. Arthur nodded grimly. "They must have assumed you'd never know. The bank listed the property under Michael's name as title holder, but because of the life estate clause, the loan isn't legally secure. Technically, they don't have the right to pledge it, but that doesn't mean they won't try to use it anyway." He waited for her reaction. Eleanor's face remained calm, her expression unreadable. Inside, though, a quiet clarity began to form, sharp, cold, and resolute. "They're in debt," she said finally, "and they thought this house would save them." Arthur leaned back, studying her. "Exactly. If the bank ever calls that loan, they're finished. Which means you hold the only real power in this situation." She looked at the papers again, at her son's signature next to his wife's. It wasn't anger she felt, it was confirmation. Proof of what she had already suspected. The people she had once called family saw her not as a person, but as a financial safety net. "Then it's time they learn who really owns it," she said quietly. Arthur nodded once. "If you're sure, I'll prepare the documents. I can find discreet buyers, someone who appreciates the property for what it is, not what it's worth on paper." Within days, he called back. "I found them," he said. "A young couple, both doctors at Mercy Hospital. Luis Hernandez and Ana Garcia. They're newly married, looking for a home with character. They love the Beaverdale-style oak trim, original floors, big porch. They want to restore it, not flip it." Eleanor smiled faintly at that. "Then they'll take good care of it." When she met the couple 2 days later, she saw the admiration in their eyes as they walked through the house. Louis traced the woodwork with reverence. Anna took photos of the sunlit windows. They spoke softly to each other, their voices full of hope. Eleanor watched them from the hallway and felt something she hadn't felt in years: peace. This house, which had once been filled with resentment and entitlement, was finally attracting love again. But before she signed anything, she made one more trip east to Davenport, where her younger sister Carol lived in a neat single-story home surrounded by dormant rose bushes. Carol had always been blunt, the kind of woman who never softened truth with sympathy. When Eleanor told her everything about the dinner, the manipulation, the loan, Carol didn't flinch. She poured them both coffee, then looked her sister straight in the eye. "You taught them how to treat you," she said matter-of-factly. "All those years of saying yes, of letting them talk over you, of fixing what they broke. You trained them to believe you'd always bend." Eleanor's hands tightened around her mug. "And now?" Carol's mouth curved into the faintest smile. "Now you teach them the opposite." The words sank deep, steady, and clear. Eleanor didn't need to respond. She just nodded slowly, her mind already settled. The next morning, she would meet Arthur again to finalize the paperwork. As she drove back home that evening, the last light of day spilled across the frozen fields, washing everything in gold. For the first time in years, she didn't feel small or powerless. She wasn't someone's mother or widow or burden. She was Eleanor Whitaker, and she was taking her life back one signature at a time. Friday morning dawned, clear and cold. The kind of winter day when sunlight bounced off every patch of snow like shards of glass. Eleanor woke before sunrise, the house still wrapped in quiet. She moved through each room slowly, her hand brushing the backs of chairs, the worn banister, the lace curtain that had hung by the kitchen window for nearly 3 decades. The house no longer felt like a prison of memories. It felt like something she had finally made peace with. She stood before the wardrobe, considering what to wear. Then her eyes landed on a dress she hadn't touched in years, a pale blue one she'd worn at Michael and Samantha's wedding. The fabric had faded slightly at the seams, but it still carried the faint scent of lavender from long ago. She smiled softly as she slipped it on. It felt symbolic somehow, to wear something from the day her son began his new life, as she prepared to begin her own. When Arthur arrived, he found her on the porch, coat buttoned, hair neatly pinned. "You look radiant," he said kindly, taking her arm as they walked toward his car. "It's a good day to end a chapter," she replied. The drive to the notary's office was silent except for the steady hum of the engine and the whisper of snow under the tires. Downtown Des Moines looked almost cheerful in the winter light. Coffee shops opening, people hurrying along the sidewalks with scarves tight around their faces. Inside the small law office, the air was warm and smelled faintly of paper and printer ink. The notary greeted them, recognized Arthur immediately, and gestured toward the conference table. A thick folder sat waiting. Arthur opened it, spreading out the documents. These confirmed the sale to Dr. Hernandez and Dr. Garcia, he explained. The payment will be wired to your account today. And here, this outlines your compensation for relinquishing the life estate. $20,000. You'll sign here, and at the bottom of the final page. Eleanor nodded, took the pen in her gloved hand, and paused only for a moment. She didn't feel sadness, just calm resolve. Then, slowly and deliberately, she signed her name, Eleanor Whitaker. The looping letters were steady, unshaken. Arthur watched her, then smiled faintly. "How do you feel?" "Like I can breathe again," she said. They shook hands with the buyers later that morning. Louis and Anna looked radiant, full of gratitude and plans. They spoke about where they'd place the Christmas tree, how they'd repaint the porch in the spring. Eleanor listened, genuinely glad. The house, at last, was going to people who would love it, not use it. By noon, everything was complete. Outside, the sunlight had softened, melting the last traces of frost on the sidewalk. Arthur drove her to a modest apartment complex near Greenwood Park, quiet, tree-lined, with wide windows and a view of the duck pond. Eleanor had signed the lease earlier that week. When she stepped inside, she immediately liked the silence. It wasn't the heavy, resentful silence of her old home. It was gentle, like a pause before something new. She placed her small suitcase by the window and stood there for a while, watching a family walk by below, a young mother holding her child's hand, the sound of laughter rising faintly through the crisp air. That afternoon, as the light began to fade, Arthur stopped by her new place. "It's done," he said, handing her a copy of the signed deed. "And I've sent the notice to Michael. He'll receive it by certified mail before dinner." Eleanor nodded, calm. "Good." It didn't take long. Just after 6 o'clock, her phone rang. She knew the number before she answered. "Mom," Michael's voice came through, tight, almost breathless. "Tell me this isn't true. You can't sell my house." Eleanor stood by the window, looking out at the park where the last streaks of sunset were fading to gold. Her tone was even, almost kind. "It was never yours while I was alive." There was silence on the line, long, stunned silence. Then a low exhale, something between disbelief and anger. "Why would you do this?" he managed to say. Eleanor didn't answer right away. She turned away from the window. glanced at the cardboard boxes still stacked neatly against the wall, and said softly, "Because I finally remembered whose life it is." Before he could respond, she ended the call. The phone clicked back into stillness. Outside, the streetlights flickered on one by one, bathing the snow in a soft amber glow. Eleanor poured herself a cup of tea and sat by the window, watching the city lights shimmer beyond the park. For the first time in years, she felt neither invisible nor small, only free. In the days that followed, the ripple of Eleanor's decision spread quickly. Michael's anger came first, sharp, loud, and immediate. He called Arthur's office, demanded explanations, accused him of manipulation, of betrayal, of turning a mother against her son. Arthur, calm as ever, reminded him that every document had been legally sound and voluntarily signed. "Your mother acted fully within her rights," he said simply, when yelling didn't work. Samantha tried pleading. Her calls came at odd hours, long voicemails filled with tears and disbelief. "We're family, Mrs. Whittaker," she said in one. "You didn't have to do this." Eleanor listened to none of them. She deleted each message without replying, her expression unchanged. By midweek, they had hired an attorney, Martin Sanders, a brisk man with a reputation for finding loopholes where none existed. He reviewed the case for 2 days before finally meeting Michael and Samantha in his downtown office. The verdict was swift and unsparing. "Legally," he said, "you have no standing. The life estate gave her full power to sell. It's airtight. There's nothing you can do." Michael had sat there in silence, his jaw tightening with each word. Samantha covered her face with her hands. By the time they left the office, the anger had drained away, replaced by a dull, aching disbelief. A few days later, a quiet knock sounded on Eleanor's door. When she opened it, she found Andrew standing there, hands stuffed in the pockets of his jacket. He looked awkward, uncertain, 16, but suddenly much older. "Mom and Dad don't know I'm here," he said softly. "I figured," Eleanor replied. "Come in." They sat at her small kitchen table, the scent of chamomile tea filling the air. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then Andrew blurted, "They said you took everything, that you betrayed us." Eleanor's gaze softened. "Did they also tell you why?" He hesitated. "No, they're really upset." She nodded slowly. "I know they are. But, Andrew, sometimes doing the right thing doesn't look kind from the outside. I gave them every chance to treat me as family. They chose to treat me as property." He looked down, frowning slightly. "Dad said it was just money problems." "It's never just money," she said quietly. "It's respect. It's honesty. It's the difference between love and ownership." He was quiet for a long time, then whispered, "I'm sorry. Grandma." Eleanor reached across the table and placed her hand over his. "You have nothing to be sorry for. Just promise me one thing. Don't grow up thinking this is how families should treat each other." He nodded, eyes glistening. Before leaving, he turned at the door. "You're kind of a badass, you know that?" Eleanor smiled. "So I've been told." A week later, Michael showed up himself. No warning. No calls ahead. Just the sound of his knock, breaking the calm of her afternoon. When Eleanor opened the door, she was almost startled by how different he looked. The sharp edges of anger were gone. In their place was something hollow and weary. "Mom," he said quietly, "I didn't think you'd ever do something like this." Eleanor met his eyes, calm and steady. "You just never bothered to see who I really was." He exhaled, the fight leaving him completely. For a brief moment, he looked like the boy she once knew, the boy who used to bring her wildflowers from the park and promise he'd take care of her someday. But that boy was long gone, replaced by a man who had mistaken entitlement for love. "I guess this is it then," he said softly. "It doesn't have to be," Eleanor replied, "but it's the first time the terms are mine." He nodded once, defeated, and left without another word. When the door closed behind him, Eleanor stood still for a while, then turned toward the window. Outside, the sun was setting over Greenwood Park, its reflection painting the surface of the lake in gold and amber. The ducks drifted lazily across the water. She settled into her armchair, a cup of tea warming her hands. The city beyond the park glowed softly, the quiet hum of evening life carrying faintly through the glass. She wasn't angry anymore. Not hurt, not vindictive. Just still. The peace she felt now wasn't about revenge. It was about finally being seen, even if it came too late. As the sky deepened into twilight, she whispered to herself, almost like a vow, they underestimated the wrong woman, and I made sure they never would again. The last light faded across the lake, and Eleanor Whittaker sat watching it, serene and unbroken, the quiet architect of her own justice,